Although I don't know. I find it different. And I'll say, I think growing up in a society like Canada, which it's a multicultural society.
Yeah.
So as Canadians, we put emphasis on our own group identities, and we sort of create this mosaic,
Yes.
or this quilt, we used to say in Canada. So the Jewish
Okay.
community, or the Caribbean communities, or the Greek community, we have sort of strong public identities, if you will, which is
Okay.
different in a sense than the melting pot that the United States is supposed to be.
Right.
So I think, in a sense, we grew up, but when instances of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism happened, say, in Montreal, the community was very fast and very strong to react.
Okay.
And there is a history, I know of certainly of places like New York, where the community was strong and vibrant, of great, rich cultural activities, and economically, socially, culturally, it was the place to be. But on the other hand, there also is a tradition in the United States of maybe not speaking out so powerfully on some issues.
Mm-hmm.
There's this dichotomy. I know elements of the community here is very strong and speaks out, but there are elements that like to keep things quiet and low key. So there's a different.
The Shah still.
There's a different character, I think, to both societies and the communities in both societies.
Absolutely, absolutely. But it's interesting, at the same parallel period, Great Neck, Montreal, such a difference. We had the anti-Semites, of course, but as far as public policy, what you mentioned about universities, we didn't have any of this. We had this kind of thing earlier, in the 40s, but we didn't have it.
Well, apparently you're going to have a Supreme Court judge who belonged to an organization that tried to keep a Ivy League school traditional in its composition.
Is that right?
Apparently, this Judge Alito was part of a group called CAP, where the alumni of Princeton University was very upset that minorities, I think i.e. African Americans, Jews, and women, were changing the dynamics of Princeton.
Yes.
And there are some universities, and there's some institutions, I think even in the United States, that was quite exclusive until the 70s, 80s.
I heard the hearings, and he was trying to distance himself from the organization.
Sure.
Saying that he was a member of it, but he really wasn't an active participant. But I guess it's questionable why he was even a member,
Right, but I think it's also important to realize that, these sort of groups and interests or ideologies are still around in all societies.
All right, let's talk about Anne Bayevsky.
So Anne Bayevsky is a professor from Osgoode Hall at the University of Toronto, and she's also a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Mm-hmm. And she is now focusing most of her research on anti-Israel activities at the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And she gave a very powerful presentation on how Israel is treated by the Security Council and other member states, and how Israel is demonized. And she actually showed part of a film that demonstrated how there was a Palestinian National Day at the United Nations, and they had a large map of Palestine which did not include Israel, and how...
Yes, I saw that.
Right.
I saw that map years ago when I went on a tour to the United Nations. It was hanging up in the hall. Really? And it was just a map of Palestine without any Israel. It wasn't even called Israel. Maybe it was an old map, I don't know, but they didn't have a subsequent map reflecting what, that there was a state of Israel today. Right.
So she does very detailed work on the history of the United Nations when it comes to Israel, and some of the policies that are being adopted and some of the rhetoric that's being presented at the UN by various member nation states.
So that's the the Hudson Institute?
Yeah.
All right. What about the Mark Cohen lecture?
Mark Cohen is a professor from Princeton University, and his area of expertise is looking at the history of Jewish communities in Islamic states. Mm-hmm. And he looked at how, he was focusing more historically on how minorities and Jewish communities existed and were treated in predominantly Muslim states in the Middle East.
And what were the conditions that he spoke of?
Well, there's a great debate. For example, Benny Morris in his lecture yesterday was saying how Jews were always second-class citizens. So there's a debate among historians and scholars how, Benny Morris is pointing out how there's been a history of massacres, and that under Islamic law, Jews are sort of second-class citizens and they never enjoyed the freedoms that some say they do. I think Professor Mark Cohn sort of falls on the other side of the argument, saying that there were sort of golden ages and there was a lot of cooperation, and that Jews in Muslim societies by and large fared well and fared much better than Jews in Christian societies. So there's a debate, and Mark Cohn presents sort of, I think, a very rich historical account of these times.
Are we talking apples to apples? I mean, how could we look at the same period and come up with such different perceptions of reality? I mean, is it at a certain time where tolerance was around, and other times where things were quite oppressive?
Right. I'm not an expert on this subject, historical time, but sure, I think all societies, there's the ebb and flow of tolerance and conflict. But what I think some people say is that, under Islamic law, people who are not Muslim don't enjoy the same rights and privileges as people who are Muslims. But that's not to say that they can't be protected under these laws. And this is where the debate goes on, which I am not an expert on. So
I see, okay. This was a real all-star cast here, these professors, and this was your first season, really. And it's just, fascinating. It's a tremendous tribute to the community that you bring these scholars of this caliber to the area here in Connecticut, Yale University. I see that going forward, you're going to have Irshad Manji. Tell us just a little sneak preview about what that lecture is going to be about.
Okay. So Irshad Manji is from Canada, and she's a social commentator. And she wrote a book called The Trouble with Islam. And she sort of, I would say, takes a feminist critique of Islamicism or extreme Islam and looks at not only sexism, but actually focuses a lot on Islamic anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews and the demonization of Israel. So she's quite brave and outspoken, and she's sort of looking at Islam from within Islam to counter the more extreme, I guess, understandings of Islamic law and Sharia law. So and she's dynamic. She'll be fantastic.
I find our conversation very fascinating because I have a lot of advocates on, and an advocate will always give the strongest possible argument for a particular side. And I feel that by the caliber and the wide spectrum of your guests, we get to hear the whole story, really.
Right. Well, I think, if I may, we're in a time now with sort of the demonization of Israel and the reemergence of anti-Semitism, that the world seems to be changing, and the reemergence of anti-Semitism, I think, is serious. Iran is trying to build a bomb, literally, to destroy Israel. And we need to have a conversation, and we need to engage people who are open to engage. And I think some of the speakers that we've been fortunate to have do that, and we need to have a conversation, and we need to debate and try to find solutions to address this serious issue.
I mean, even people like Walid Shubat that has come here in Rabbi Rock has conceded that 70% of the Muslims in the area in Palestine are fun-loving people that really are not into suicide bombing. And so I think it's guests like yourself, like Walid Shubat and others, that help educate the general public, and that's what we're trying to do here in Rabbi Rock. And it's really very, very pleasurable having you here.
Pleasure. Honored to be here. Thank you.